Hey everyone, Thomas here, and today we're going to talk about DIY and buy. Basically meaning, do you want to buy assets or do you want to make them yourself? Of course, this is a very controversial topic, so join us along the ride. So you're making your own game. You can make everything yourself, your own models, code, controllers, everything. Or you can just go to the asset store, whip out your credit card, spend a couple $100 and bam, you have something that resembles a game at least. Now, what should you do? As I said, it depends. You want to make sure your game feels unique. You want to make sure that you don't feel like an asset flip, things like that. So we're going to cover how you do that. Let's start with the big question. Should you do it? Well, it depends. It depends on a couple of factors actually. Your skills, is it your core game mechanic? What is the goal of your project? Your mentality? And how much money and time do you have? You have to take all those into account before you can take an actual informed decision. So we're going to cover when you should and when you probably shouldn't do it, and cover what we ourselves did wrong in our game Forge Industry, which you of course can wishlist down below. Alright, so let's answer a couple of questions. When should you do this? First of all, when creating prototypes, this is an amazing tool to just buy a quick asset, get it working as soon as possible so you can get feedback. Is your core gameplay loop fun? Things like that. So your first go-to is, okay, if you have the money, go ahead, spend about $50 or whatever on an asset on the store so you can just iterate quickly. Do keep in mind that Unity also partners up with Humble every now and then, so keep an eye out on that because you can get some amazing deals. When can you also use these bought assets? Well, when they are not vital to your core gameplay loop. This is already a bit more personal preference, of course, because of course you can do it if you really want to. But for example, an asset that handles achievements or something like that is not something that is core to your gameplay loop, and it won't really feel like a copy of something else. The same with something like UI components and things like that. Another time you can actually use these assets is when they are easily modifiable. What do I mean by that? It can be, well, very broad. It can be code that is easily inheritable or tweakable or whatever, to models and sounds that you can just plunk together in Audacity and make sound unique, or models that you can tweak easily, or you make your own custom shader for them, things like that. Why is that? You don't want your game to feel like an asset flip. Asset flipping is when you just go to the Unity store, swipe your credit card about 20 times, plonk everything that you just bought into a game engine like Unity, hit build, and you're done. That's not what we want here. We want to make a unique experience for our player. Another quick tip to keep in mind is if you use these easily modifiable assets like models or something like that, do keep in mind to also add your own models, so it's not just only bought assets. This is also very important to make your game not feel like an asset flip. And even if your game has unique mechanics, so the coding part is completely unique, do try to make at least some custom art for it, like custom models and things like that, because it's very easily recognizable when you just go to the asset store, get your cheapest Cinti models like everyone loves these days, plug this into a game, and you're done. These characters are very easily recognizable, at least for game devs. Maybe for the general public it's a bit less, but still try to avoid just using only Cinti assets, for example. This is not to say they are bad, by the way. And the last point where you should probably use them is when they save you time or money, but not just now, in the long run. This is very important. It is also probably the hardest to determine if it is actually worth it, because there are a lot of assets that get you up and running quickly, but once you try to modify or tweak or get that mechanic just right, they are very hard to customize. We actually made this mistake in our own game, Forge Industry. Once again, please wishlist down below. And you can also play it on Steam Next Fest, by the way, whatever. Basically, we also did this and we started using the A-Star Pathfinding project, which is a crit asset in itself for our game, where we have our workers walk around between buildings and things like that. However, this is a very vital part of our game because what makes us unique is the way we transfer items in a factory automation game. And we could probably make it work with the A-Star Pathfinding project, but the amount of code that is already there, or if you have to modify it, it takes a lot of time, and you have to basically make an assumption. Is it going to save me money or time, in this case, in the long run? In this case, it wasn't the case, so we completely nuked it and wrote our own pathfinding project. Well, that's going great, by the way, but At least we have fine-grained control now, which is very important. So I just covered when you probably should or at least can use them. When you really shouldn't, well, we're going to cover these right now. First of all, if all you do is assets, it is a way to work, I guess, but you won't really learn anything. It's very, in my opinion, you won't really get anything positive out of it because your game will feel very asset flippy once again. Also, it gives us as game developers and indies a bad name, so please stop. Another point when you don't want to use them is if you need a lot of fine-grained control, or if it's your core mechanic, like I just explained with our own example. If it is something your game relies on heavily, you have to think about this as a dependency on another developer. And since that developer won't always be available to fix their bugs, or even with the great reviews, and you see in the asset store, a lot of indie asset store developers actually give great support, but you always have to wait for the next update. You always have to rely on them. While at the same time, if you just develop it yourself, it might cost a bit more of time in the beginning, but a lot of the time for a big fine-grained controlled mechanic, it will save you time in the long run. Another example of this is in our Gameforge industry, we use a GPU instancer, which is a great tool to quickly draw a lot of objects on the screen, like trees, workers, things like that in our case. However, there was a bug in it once where our workers were very metallic and they just didn't show properly, they didn't render properly. Of course, we can just dive into the code because you get the C# files basically and try to figure it out. But it's so big and a lot of work that you basically rely on the developer. Of course, he did fix it, luckily, but it's always a waiting game. So another thing where you probably shouldn't use, for example, an asset for is something we also did in the past, is something that already has great Unity implementation. An example of this is we used Rewired for a long time, which is great in itself, don't get me wrong, good asset, but we didn't really need it. Also, the new Unity system is miles better than the previous one, with the action-based system. So if you can just use that, it's a great alternative. So before you go ahead and spend your hard-fought money, just think about if you really need it. The last thing when you probably shouldn't is when you only use easily recognizable assets. The biggest part of this is, once again, I love their work, but Cinti, because a lot of the developers just use them. The characters are, in my opinion, super easy to recognize. If you just use like trees and things like that, it's, well, not very recognizable. But the core things in your game, for example, your main character, things like that, you really should make them feel unique. So, to summarize, very shortly, because I value your time. When you should use them, creating prototypes, when it's not vital to your game, when you're easily modifiable assets, when it saves you time and money in the long run. When you shouldn't, if you only use assets, it's a bad idea. If you need a lot of fine-grained control or it's your core game mechanic, and when they are easily recognizable. Those are the times when I wouldn't use assets. And that about wraps it up for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, all those things, because it really does help us out. And in return, you get 2 videos a week, which hopefully are useful to you as well. I think Marnix always calls it a win-win situation, so let's both start at winning.